1, and I'd like to call the Community Planning and Economic Development Committee meeting to order. We have committee members, our Councilman Zdanowicz and Ben Winograd. We also have joining us Town Manager Rick Ledwith, Tim McClochie, Todd DeMay, Joy Martin, Greg Summer, and Council Member Deb Poland. Has anyone else jumped on that I didn't see? I think that's everybody. So our first item would be approval of the minutes from the March 15th, 2023 meeting. What?
I move acceptance.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, then we can move on. Those are accepted. And for item B under number 2, business items, we'll go to Town Manager Ledwith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good evening. Good to see everyone. We appreciate everyone's flexibility today. As I know, this is our second standing committee meeting of the day. So thank you all so much for your time today. What we would like to do in terms of meeting structure, if it is okay with you, Madam Chair, is to move the complete streets policy discussion to the end of the meeting and then move the 5 zoning ordinances up to the first part of the meeting. In terms of the zoning ordinances, we have our town planner, Todd DeMay, with us tonight to walk us through these 5 ordinances. And what we wanted to do was to break these 5 into essentially 2 separate discussions. The first 3 we would discuss are the accessory dwelling units, the residential parking standards ordinance. Both of these ordinances are the results of changes to the Connecticut general statutes. So we're required to bring our zoning ordinances into compliance with these changes. I'd also mention that we previously discussed these ordinances with CPED back in January of 2022. So they may seem familiar to some of our committee members. The other ordinance is a change to our special use permit process that was requested by our TPZ commission. So if it's okay with the committee, we would place these 3 ordinances on the May 9th council agenda, where they would be referred to TPZ and then set for a council public hearing on June 13th. So those will be the first 3 we discuss. The next 2 ordinances are a proposed ordinance for incentive-based commercial district standards, and then a proposed ordinance for Connecticut Craft Cafe permit. And I'll just go back for a moment. Back when the council approved the hiring of a senior planner for the planning and zoning division, one of the reasons we needed that position was not only to help with the workload, of course, but also to allow our town planner the time to look more proactively at our zoning ordinances instead of reactively. And that's what both of these ordinances do. And I appreciate Mr. DeMay's approach to both of these proposed changes. These 2 ordinances will require a little more time, a little more work from a language standpoint between our town planner and our corporation council. But if everything goes as planned, we would potentially place both of these ordinances on our May 23rd council agenda and be referred to TPZ from there, and then they would be set for a public hearing on July 11th. So we'd have a public hearing for the first 3 ordinances on June 13th, and then we would have the second public hearing for these final 2 ordinances, if everything gets approved by the 23rd, on July 11th. So I will stop there, Madam Chair, through you, turn things over to our town planner, Mr. DeMay, and Todd will be able to summarize all 5 of these ordinances for the committee this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ledwith. I guess I'll take up the accessory apartment or accessory dwelling ordinance first. As Mr. Ledwith said, this ordinance is the result of the adoption of Public Act 2129. That was a fairly comprehensive act titled an act concerning the zoning enabling, which also addressed accessory apartments training for land use officials and a number of other elements that deal directly with our zoning. The specific conversation we'll have, that's the subject of this ordinance, pertains to the council's recently adopted accessory dwelling unit standards. Those standards were adopted in January of 2021 and largely track the adoption of the Public Act language, which set a statewide standard for towns to adopt or affirmatively opt out of the ADU process. However, the state's adopted language did reveal a number of minor conflicts between the state's adopted enabling legislation and our local ordinance. So what the ordinance before we're proposing to bring to the council would correct those conflicts, and they are as follows. The first one relates to the size of accessory dwelling units. So our ordinance, as currently stated, states an accessory dwelling unit shall have a minimum gross floor area of 400 square feet and a maximum gross floor area of 800 square feet, or 30% of the gross floor area of the principal dwelling unit, whichever is less. So the change in the state statute said you can't set a net floor area for an accessory apartment of not less than 30% of the net floor area of the primary dwelling unit, or 1,000 feet, whichever is less, and you can't establish a minimum. So the first part of the change of the ordinance would get rid of the minimum 400 square feet. That's covered elsewhere in that any dwelling unit must be consistent with any applicable building or fire codes, should they have a minimum size threshold. And then the second part would be essentially just moving up the threshold from 800 square feet to 1,000 square feet. The 30% stays exactly as is. The second conflict between our ordinance and the state statute is around setbacks and bulk standards. So what Public Act 2129 said is you can't require, a municipality can't require setbacks or other bulk standards, including lot coverage, greater than or equal to that of which is required for the principal dwelling unit. So in a number of limited circumstances, we had a couple of conflicts between the ordinance, which established a 30% coverage threshold for any accessory dwelling unit, and also imposed setback limitations of 10 feet for a detached accessory structure. In some instances, on our smaller zoned lots, the primary buildings can be built closer than 10 feet. So we're proposing a change that addresses that conflict. Lastly, the other change would be the ordinance no longer, or we're not allowed to require a separate exterior access into an accessory dwelling unit unless otherwise required by building or fire code.
You're not eating?
Mark, you're not on mute.
He muted. I think he just muted.
Yeah, I muted him.
Okay.
So those are the three changes to the ordinance. It doesn't materially change the ordinance that was adopted. I'd like to report to the council since January of 2021, there have been 8 accessory dwelling unit applications that have been approved, one of which is a detached accessory structure. Based on my review of the applications that were approved, the changes proposed in this ordinance to address the state statute, none of those would have been triggered. There were no threshold issues. In all instances, we actually, those comply with the ordinance as is. I don't know if any of those would have taken advantage had these new standards been in place. But that's the change to the accessory dwelling unit ordinance, and I can stop there and be happy to answer any questions.
I have one. So you said there's been 8 applications approved. Were there any that weren't approved that might have been approved under these standards?
There were not, Chair McGinnis, there was one that ended up applying for a variance to one of the existing standards that I think probably is related to one of these changes, and that standard said that exterior access shall be provided to the accessory dwelling units in accordance with our requirements. And in that instance, the exterior access was visible from the street. So that property was a corner lot, so it had 2 front yards. So no matter how the applicant proposed, it was an internal above the garage accessory dwelling unit that had its own access coming down to the street. But no matter how they proposed that exterior access, it was visible from the street with the language that we're proposing to remove. In that instance, the homeowner would have not needed to go through the variance process. The application as submitted would have been consistent with the requirements.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Councilman Winograd?
Thank you. I just want to, I won't be there on the 13th, unfortunately, so I will remind Todd, thank you for always mentioning that we got it first, that the state took it from us. So as long as you promise to, yet again, make that when you present that to the full council and to the TPC, I would appreciate it. And thank you for all your work on this. Again, we came pretty close, but we've known we had to make a couple adjustments, and they all look good to me. So I'm glad the state process went well, and again, I appreciate all your efforts on this.
So do we want to move on to are there any other questions? Don't see any. Do you want to move on to the next ordinance?
Sure. Thank you, Chair McGinnis. So the next ordinance we'll talk about similarly related to that public act. This pertains to our residential parking standards. So this might get a bit confusing, but the conclusion or the recommendation is pretty straightforward. So again, as part of that same Public Act 2129, the state adopted a new approach to parking. Its approach to parking was an attempt to what I would call right-size parking standards across the state. And it really sought to ensure municipalities limit artificially high parking minimums that many municipalities throughout the state place specifically on residential units, and really curb the overconstruction of parking. Obviously, we hear frequently, you as the council and the zoning authority hear frequently from developers that the construction of parking, and particularly parking that's not needed, has a number of associated negative impacts from the developer's perspective. It increases the cost of development, but there's also environmental impacts. It increases the loss of tree and vegetative cover, impervious cover. You know, Mr. Martin and Mr. Ledwith and the council are very familiar with those impacts and stormwater, and it just increases many negative costs. So the state sought to curb that by requiring an across-the-board standard based on bedroom count. And what was adopted was that a municipality and its zoning ordinances could not require more than one space for each studio or one bedroom in a dwelling unit, or more than two spaces for each dwelling unit of two or more bedrooms. So this was previously discussed, as Mr. Ledwith said, twice, most recently in the winter of 2022 with CPED. And what we did at that time is the council directed us to do a little bit more research and then bring back the findings within a proposed amendment. And in West Hartford, we regulate and have historically regulated parking on a per unit count. So we have a standard for two units or any multifamily building of 1.5 spaces per dwelling unit, but we don't specify the bedroom count. And then in the newly adopted transit-oriented development district, we specified only one space per dwelling unit. And then we have another outlying district, the traditional neighborhood design district, in which we require 1.5 spaces per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area of a unit. So in order to understand what is the impact to the town, to the municipality, if we had that same standard, the state standard that's now adopted in place, I and Mr. Pudlick did some research. We looked back to 2012 at all of the site plans, special development districts that were approved for multifamily housing. And in that time, there have been 1,464 residential units in those classes, multifamily, approved. Of that 1,464 residential units, if we apply our base standard, that would have required 2,240 spaces of parking. However, the actual number of parking spaces that was ultimately approved vis-a-vis our existing processes was slightly less. It was 2,170 for a net ratio of approximately 1.48 spaces per dwelling unit. That slight reduction is due to your authority as a council in zoning and improving special development districts, which afford applicants the ability to reduce or waive parking standards on a project-by-project basis. So if we look at that number and then compare it to just applying the standard based on a bedroom count, that standard would have netted 2,028 spaces, or a ratio of about 1.39 per dwelling unit. So if we just look at that number there, we're a little bit more than 150 spaces more than the state standard. It looks like our standard is more impactful and thus requires more parking. However, what the analysis revealed is if we actually look at all 20 of those projects that netted us over 1,400 units of housing, in 14 of those projects, if we took the state standard and applied it to that same project, in 14 instances, the state's standard would have required more parking than our current standard. And the reason for that is really the variability of applying a parking standard based on the bedroom count and thus the unit count within a project. So it's not a straightforward, theirs requires less than ours. In some instances it does, in others it doesn't. So that was a very long way of kind of proposing a relatively minor change. So in the instances where we specify in the zoning ordinances parking standards, the suggested language to be compliant with the state standard, but also preserve the town's flexibility at approving reduced parking ratios, we suggested stating for 2 families or dwellings of 3 or more units to require 1 space for each studio or 1 bedroom unit, 2 spaces for each dwelling unit with 2 or more bedrooms, or 1.5 spaces per dwelling unit, whichever's less. That way it preserves the flexibility of our current language, but also meets the intent in those instances where we might otherwise require more parking. So the net gain of this process would require less parking overall as a multifamily project comes forward. And I will pause there and be happy to answer any questions. I saw Mr. Winograd's hand up.
Tiffany, you're muted. I was waiting to say.
Okay, that seems to be contagious today.
Have a good night.
Mr. Winograd, do you have a question?
Thank you. Yeah, I love the chart. And what you're seeing out of my head as I look at it. Your column on the far right, the more or less, was comparing the I think I read it wrong the first time. You're comparing what we required versus what the state required, or you're comparing? I think you are.
So, Councilor Winograd, the far column, the difference was if the state's requirement compared to ours. So the way I worded it was, in instances where the state required more than our current. However, I would note there are 2 of those more categories that weren't picked up, and those were instances where projects were approved vis-a-vis a special development district approval. So I could call out, for instance, the one that pops into mind is the fellowship housing, the 1060 Starkle Road. So in 2019, there was a significant redevelopment of that whole complex approved. And if you look right in the dead middle of the column here, that was approved at 281 parking spaces, or 1.1 spaces per dwelling unit. If we applied our normal standard of 1.5 spaces, that would have required the development to provide for 428 spaces. And if we applied the state standard, the new standard, it would have still required 309 spaces, or about 30 more than we ultimately required. So there are 2 instances in that column that weren't captured because, those were special development district approvals that netted less parking.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. I guess my question is, and I couldn't pick it up, kind of find it on this chart. Do we have any approvals where, and I see some where they built significantly more than our minimum, so our changing the minimum doesn't do anything in terms of disadvantaging the developer. They wanted to put more in. Do we have any though where, as a result of this, someone might decide they don't need as many as they were planning? And I'm thinking some of the ones that even, I mean, some aren't built yet, or still being built, or even they might be built and they would now be able to get rid of parking spaces if they want to. I mean, do we have any impact on these?
Madam Chair, through you to Councilor Winograd. So what this ordinance doesn't do, I think I understand your question, Councilor Winograd. It does not actually go back and change anyone's standard. However, it does apply going forward to the standard, but it doesn't set a parking maximum. I think that's where I think your mind is going, is whether or not this could curb the overdevelopment, because you are correct. If you look at this chart and you look at it closely, there are any number of instances, including many of the recent approvals of housing, whereby the developer proposes more parking than we require. So we set a minimum, and that's all that this ordinance is doing, is attempting to fix our minimum standards to be compliant with the state statute. Well, short of
What I'm questioning is, I guess you're right. I know there's no maximum. I guess what I'm wondering is whether any of these developments might, if they came back to us and said, we want to have less parking because you've changed the standards and we'd like to get down to the minimum, the new minimum. Is that, how would that, if they were interested in that, I'm not sure anybody would that be as of right? I mean, obviously it's a special development district, we'd have to approve it, but I'm just wondering what the process would be if somebody wanted to reduce parking down to a level that would be the new minimum.
Sure. Madam Chair, through you to Councilor Winograd, so if we look at the bottom four listed projects, so the most recent listed 2023s through 2022s, so kind of going backwards, the only two that stand out in that chart are the projects that were approved for the former Children's Museum site, 950 Troutbrook Ave. And I'm just going to call out the ratio. So that was approved at the developer's request at a ratio of 1.9 spaces per dwelling unit, which is 0.4 above where we were. And then there was an as-of-right site plan approved at 54 North Main Street for 22 units at a ratio of 1.7 spaces per dwelling unit. So if in either instance, if one of those developers came back and say, hey, we want to amend our approval and we want to take advantage of these new, in both instances, if you go and look at what would the standard be with this new language, in one, it would be 6 less spaces, and the other, it could be close to 50 spaces. The site plan would be an as-of-right administrative amendment because the initial approval was an administrative process. And in the other, since that was a special development approval, that would exceed my authority as an administrative process. And that would trigger an application to the council for an amendment to their plan. And if it was an amendment to their plan, it would presumably also include some minor architectural or landscape changes. If they don't need that much parking, I would presume that those spaces would be reverted to either landscaping, screening, buffer, or some other use within the building itself. Does that answer your question, Councilor Winograd?
It does. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Are there any other questions on this ordinance?
I have.
Madam Mayor?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am wondering about the TOD and what if there and how that intersects and how that works.
Madam Chair, through you to the Mayor, the TOD ordinance, we looked at that. It's a great question, Mayor, and this does not negatively impact that ordinance because that ordinance was fairly forward-thinking and it set a parking requirement well below even that of which the state requires. So across the TOD in any multifamily project, it's only 1 space per dwelling unit, 1 bedroom studio, 2 or 3. So there is no conflict there. So we established that minimum standard. And then if you'll recall, we also have even more flexibility through that shared parking analysis and model that's afforded to those properties in the TOD.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question on this ordinance? Okay, if there are no further questions, I believe the next ordinance is the special use permit. Is that right? 177-42A?
It is. Thank you, Madam Chair. So this ordinance really comes by way of frustration, maybe, from the Planning and Zoning Commission. I don't want to use that term too loosely. So the council, and particularly your ability to function as the zoning authority, probably will understand this once I explain it. So the Planning and Zoning Commission is identified as the land use authority for a certain class of uses that are identified in our zoning ordinances as special use permits. And those are, I'm just going to read it because it's a bit odd. They are declared to possess characteristics of such unique and distinct circumstance from other specific uses that they're considered on an individual case. Special use permits shall be deemed to be permitted uses in their respective districts, subject to the satisfaction of the requirements set forth, and it's set forth in the special use permit approval process and standards. And so the Planning Commission has to review and approve of any special use permit or any change to an existing special use permit vis-a-vis a public hearing. So all the abutting properties are notified. Then on top of that, 2 years after the approval, the applicant has to come back before the Planning Commission for another public hearing process to determine, was that approval okay? And are there any other conditions that need to be addressed or imposed on an applicant? So you might ask, well, what is a special use permit? Really, there are classes of uses such as any place of worship, schools, institutional uses, daycare centers, any government facility, or golf courses. And they're deemed special because they're mostly located in residential zoning districts. So they're not all, on the surface residential, but they're deemed to be important and special and can coexist in those uses. The result is, even when you have really minor amendments, such as a shed, a fence, a shade structure over a playground, we have applications made, neighbors noticed, and we go through a cost and a process at the end of the day for a minor amendment that is still consistent with the overall special use, but it has to be treated as if that whole use were being adopted. So the Planning Commission asked staff, after 3 or 4 such minor amendments over the past few months in a row, to explore other options. Fortunately, we didn't have to look too far because our zoning ordinance already outlined that process, and the council should be familiar with it because it exists within the Special Development District framework. Within the Special Development District framework, there is a carved out process that affords the town planner to approve of minor amendments to special development districts. And then it specifies the type of approvals that I'm authorized and a framework for doing so. It still includes a letter or notice to the council, a sign to be posted on the property to let neighbors know, and then the ability for the council to override a recommendation from my office and still set a hearing. So the ordinance before you takes a very similar approach, and it outlines that same process, saying the planner may approve minor amendments to a previously issued special use permit. And then it establishes what those are. So an accessory structure or modification to an accessory structure, but it's only up to 250 square feet. So that's a shed, right? That's a 20 by 20 shed or some other small structure. Minor additions to buildings. You think about it. Some churches and schools are really large. So in this instance, it's up to 500 square feet or 10% of the building, whichever's less. Also to allow for some flexibility in either the total amount of or the arrangement of parking, whichever's less. And then it just restates that I can't approve an administrative process that would exceed the underlying standards of the zoning district. It doesn't give me special authority that would otherwise only be allowed for vis-a-vis the council and your STD process or by the ZBA. And then it carries forward that same important public notice process. So it requires me to send a letter to the Planning Commission 10 days before one of their meetings. It requires me to state affirmatively that the commission may reject my approval. And if it does reject my approval, it has to hold a hearing on the matter. And then it limits any such approval to once every 6 months. Again, same language comes out of the Special Development District process. So that's the intent of that ordinance. I would say that's kind of forward thinking as well, in that it could significantly save many of these classes of uses time, money, an effort on minor amendments that are generally consistent with and applicable and should be approved and do get approved as part of that process. We've looked back at since 2012, and we have over 180 special use permits approved, and only about 20% of those would even fall into this class of being eligible. So it's not going to throw away the special use permit approval process. It just streamlines it to ensure that only the ones that really require that full hearing process go that way. And that's the intent of this ordinance.
Does anyone have questions? Mr. Winograd.
Sorry, just real quick, I had not realized that we had the 6-month limitation, the twice a year in the model. Was it talked about? I mean, it struck me this time that seems overly restrictive, since you can be vetoed anyway. So I'm not sure why we have it. Again, I didn't realize we had it for council, and maybe we should revisit it, but for another day. But was there any discussion? Is there any concern about having it happen more than once every 6 months?
Madam Chair, through you to Councilor Winograd. Yes, we actually discussed that both at the Planning Commission level, and then I think in the past we've discussed this at the council level. Back in 2017, don't quote me on the exact date, we actually revised the Special Development District Administrative Amendment process. And when we did that, we added once every 6 months. It used to be once every calendar year. So we allowed for twice the frequency of Special Development District amendments. And then we actually upped the size limitations on a number of the elements included as part of that process. I do think 6 months is probably an appropriate number or metric to start with, both keeping in the SDD and starting here in the SUP process. And the reason for that is, to avoid anyone going through a segmentation process whereby they submit a series of repetitive minor amendments just to avoid having a public hearing and engagement with the higher authority. And I know theoretically the council could say, or the planning commission could say, oh no, well, this is the 4th one, we're going to hold a hearing. But I think it's more effective actually saying that's 2 per year, and then it forces proactive planning efforts on a developer's part, and nothing prohibits in either instance of someone bringing a larger application, or if they had 1 or 2 approved, from going through the process. So I think it's a good balancing act, Councilor Winograd, between the 2 options.
Am I, maybe I read it, maybe I'm reading it wrong. Is that a limitation on the applicant or on you?
It's designed to be read as both. So it's a limitation on the number of administrative applications that can be brought and or approved under this process.
Okay. So it isn't just a matter of an applicant breaking it up. It's even if a couple of valid ones come in at the same time, you have to decide which one you can approve and which one you'd have to then send to TPC. If the both were otherwise ones that you think you could approve.
Right. I suppose that if an applicant was bringing them forward, they would package them together in one. So it's per use permit.
No, I'm sorry. One of us is completely missing the other one's understanding. I think it's me. No, but if one applicant comes in, brings in one, applicant A, applicant B brings one, applicant C brings one, totally different projects, different parts of town. Can you approve all 3?
Yeah,
in 6
now
months?
I see your confusion. Yeah, the planning commission had the same language. It is drawn from the STD and it's kind of written like that, so I understand. So this gets pulled forward as part of an individual special use permit. So for special use permit number 1000, right, you get 2 a year. Special use permit number 1001 could come in for 2 a year. So yes, I could approve an unlimited number of these in any given year for individual special use permits, but any individual special use permit could only get 2 a year.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, I was misreading that completely, and thank you for the clarification.
The planning commission raised the same question. I can work with Corp Counsel to see if we can tweak that a bit to make it really clear that that's the intent. That's how it functions on the STD process. But maybe we can add some clarifying language in here just to make sure that it reads clearly.
Thank you. Are there any other questions on this ordinance? Councilor Poland.
Yes, thank you. And actually, I did have that same question that Councilor Winograd did, so I too would agree that maybe some clarifying language. But my second question is, just so I can understand the process a little bit better, you would send your recommendation to TPZ 10 days prior to one of their meetings. And if they do nothing, then your recommendation is considered approved. Is that how it works? But if they do something, then they can overturn your recommendation?
Madam Chair, through you to Councilor Poulin, that's essentially correct. So my recommendation would have to appear as a communication item on that next agenda. They would still have to vote to receive the recommendation, just as you do when one of these appears on your agenda. So there's a vote to receive it. That would be the approval. If they vote to reject it, then that would start a different process and they'd go through the public hearing process.
Thank you. And one additional question through you, Madam Chair. Does this process, new recommended process, eliminate the letters that go out to the neighbors?
Yes, it would. That's a good question, Councilor Poulin. It would eliminate the direct butter notice, but it would not eliminate the notice to post a sign. Since it's minor, that's the trade-off.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions on this ordinance? I do not see any. Was the next one the Craft Cafe ordinance? So if you, seeing that there's no other questions, if you want to go ahead with that one, that'd be great.
Since it's almost approaching happy hour, it's a perfect time to start talking about cafes. So what might not be clear to many is the oversight that the State Department of Consumer Protection, particularly the Liquor Control Division, has on enforcing and licensing businesses that engage in sale of alcoholic liquor. So the Liquor Control Division administers the licensing procedure for the sale of any type of alcoholic liquor consistent with the state statutes governing the matter. And as part of that process, they actually classify fairly granularly all of the types of liquor permits into several dozen different permit types. And each of those is administered and regulated by the Liquor Control Division in different ways. And from time to time, Liquor Control Division updates or reclassifies or actually adds new permit types to that process. And one new permit type was created a few years ago, and we never had anyone approach us looking to take advantage of it, but it was for what's called a Connecticut Craft Cafe permit. And that permit type was really designed to permit establishments that already have a liquor manufacturing permit. So liquor manufacturing, that's the parlance in West Hartford. It only applies currently to our two breweries, right? So they are liquor manufacturers under their parlance. And or you could have a distillery. And so we have several, Connecticut-based distilleries throughout the state. So those are our manufacturers. And it would allow for them to get a new liquor permit type that allows them to sell spirits that are not manufactured, well, that are not produced on their site, but have to be manufactured in the state of Connecticut. And if for anyone that might be familiar or has visited one of the Connecticut farm wineries in the state, which there are many, and I encourage everyone to do, if you go to those wineries and they have one of these permits, you'll notice that they sell the wine they produce at the vineyard, but many of them also sell Connecticut craft beer or other Connecticut craft spirits. So it's very similar to that process. Consistent across all of those permit types, including the Connecticut Craft Cafe permit, as part of the review and approval process, if a permittee comes into a local municipality, they have to get a number of local municipal officials to sign off on their liquor control permit. One of those is our zoning enforcement officer, and they're charged with ensuring that that permit type is a permitted use, which is the problem. Our zoning ordinances only permit or authorize a limited number of alcoholic liquor permits, and Craft Cafe permit is not one of those. So relatively recently, one of our existing breweries in town came in to try to take advantage of this new class of permit. they believe that it would further strengthen and support of the growth of their establishment. And if you really look at the purpose and intent of the permit type, really combined with the Liquor Control Division's oversight, I think this is a good candidate for a minor amendment that really will help our local breweries in town potentially take advantage of it. It also supports the broader Connecticut-based liquor manufacturers and local businesses. So the fairly simple change here would be to amend our current section that deals with alcoholic beverages, specifically the section that calls out and permits manufacturer's permit, and just adds in and the sale of alcoholic liquor under a Connecticut craft cafe permit. And that is really the kind of the extent of this fairly minor change. But there's a local business in town that could take advantage of this minor change.
Are there any questions on this ordinance? I just wanted to ask, do you know offhand, I know you said we would have to approve this, but do you know of any in Hartford or anywhere around that has this type of permit? I was just wondering,
Madam Chair, I don't, but before we go to hearing, we could definitely reach out to the Liquor Control Division and see how many such permits are issued and try to find an example or two that might have one.
and this is being brought from, the change was a request from one of our breweries.
That's
Is that-
correct.
Okay,
And because
thank
it's-
you.
it's that narrow class where it's designed to be paired with a manufacturer. We only have 2 instances, but if you read through the information and you read through the liquor control description, it seems like it's well intended, and I don't think there'd be negative consequences.
Right.
Kind of opening that new class of permit.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay. So I guess we can move on to the last ordinance, which I'm not going to read the whole ordinance name because it's very long.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. And this might be the last ordinance tonight. However, as Mr. Ledwith mentioned to you, I have at least 2 or 3 or 4 other ordinances that I'd look to bring back before you that are fairly all proactive in their approach. So just want everyone to be aware that we'll be hopefully talking about more zoning changes in the not too distant future. So this ordinance is really designed to take advantage of a tool that the council has recently and successfully utilized in 2 different occasions. And it seeks to create to expand the incentive-based zoning approach that was recently included in both the central business district and more recently in the adoption of the transit-oriented design district. And in doing so, the central business district was our first incentive-based approach. And what that did was created a series of standards that were designed to provide for bonusable amenities when it provided a developer or property owner for greater floor area or residential density. Last December, the council approved the first development, Center Park Place on LaSalle and Arapahoe Road, and it significantly utilized provisions of that bonus standard. That standard was only eligible to an applicant vis-a-vis the approval of a special development district. Contained within it, it requires specific findings that the council must make in order to approve those bonus standards. The second type of tool that was adopted was part of your adoption of the transit-oriented development zoning district. There were similar bonus standards. That district is an administrative approval process. However, the incentives are similar, and they're designed to promote creation of more complete neighborhoods. And in doing so, they afford the developer more floor area ratio, more building coverage, or a reduction in parking. So we have our first application that's come in for review under that TOD process, and hopefully that is approved in the next 30 or so days. But looking forward and then looking to our plan of conservation and development, trying to think about what other zones might we be able to compare this tool with and bring something similar on a small scale. And when I looked at the zoning districts and the POCD, our current standards have a similar alteration of standards around our BND, which is our Neighborhood Business Design District. So that allows for increased building height and FAR standards in the BND zone. However, it's never been used. So I looked at that as a tool or a framework and then say, okay, well, why was that not used? And then I looked at two other districts, all three of which are designed to be neighborhood friendly and community focused and be integrated into neighborhoods. And those were the Neighborhood Business District, the BN, and then the Shopping Center District, the BS. And I promise I didn't come up with the acronyms for each district, but that's what they are. So the Neighborhood Business District and the BND, those districts are to provide convenience goods and services for neighboring residential areas. So the commercial uses are intended to be provide for daily needs of neighboring residents, and they don't depend on market areas significantly larger than those small neighborhood districts. Residential uses are permitted. So that's really kind of the purpose of those truly neighborhood, mixed use districts. Similarly, but on a slightly larger scale, the shopping center district, the purpose of that district is to encourage concentration of a wider variety of stores and services and activities within the town. It's more of a major shopping and/or community center. They're intended to be related to our major road systems served by public transit. And if residential uses are provided, they can be provided as long as they're compatible with the rest of the uses in that district. That district encourages higher design standards as part of it because it's typically larger single owner tract properties. So when I looked at utilizing the standards in 177.16.5, that's the alteration of standards in B&D that have not ever been used, and create a new framework. What I've laid out for proposing is taking those three districts and creating a new process whereby the council, only by issuance of a special development district, can approve increases or bonus standards, provided you make specific findings that any approvals conceptually sensitive with the design and appropriate scale in taking into a look at the surrounding neighborhoods, that it incorporates adequate landscape or open space to ensure that the increased intensity is okay, that adequate right-sized parking is provided, and there's adequate street capacity, appropriate bicycle pedestrian amenities. These are all things which you would otherwise partially have to do as part of your special development district findings, but have created a higher threshold with these incentive-based approaches. So the bonus standards, I looked right to our TOD standards because I think they're well crafted. I think they're applicable in each of these three zones. And we would want to encourage people, if they provide affordable housing, they should get some kind of a bonus. If they provide public space, they should get a bonus. This is what the ordinance suggests anyway. If it's an infill development, it should be eligible for a bonus. If it provides for access management, so if we consolidate and reduce curb cuts, that's a very important thing for neighborhoods. And then lastly, if it incorporates any type of sustainable or green building technologies, we should bonus for that. So this kind of marries the two approaches, the BC incentive-based approach with the TOD approach, and creates this new process. Within the confines, or if we're looking, you might ask, okay, where are these districts located? So if we look at the BS district, there's only a handful of properties, about 10, but they're spread throughout our major corridors, Bishop's Corner, Corbin's Corner, and Sunset Triangle. The Neighborhood Business District, the BN, there's about 28 properties spread mostly along the intersection, or along New Britain Avenue at the intersection of New Britain Avenue and South Main, along South Main and Sedgwick, along Oakwood, and then along Newington Road just before the Newington Town Line. And then lastly, that B&D district, there's only about 10 properties, all of which are along Farmington Avenue, just east of the center. And I referenced the POCD because I think that's important. If we do look at the POCD, I think this, any number of things, an ordinance like this, and if this is not the final version, that's fine. But within the POCD, it calls for encouraging mixed-use, higher density development in proximity to existing or planned transit or commercial districts. I think all of these districts are on existing bus transit lines or their existing commercial districts. The POCD encourages the town to review its zoning standards and identify targeted modifications to modernize our approaches to commercial parking. This ordinance, when we pair it with that bonus standard, allows for a reduced parking requirement, so it does that. And it also allows for targeted, the POCD says we should look at the commercial districts and find ways to target modifications that provide for different or innovative approaches to bulk standards and use restrictions. And again, I think that this incentive-based approach, given our relatively recent track record with a few projects coming forward and utilizing it, also meets that threshold. So I'll stop there and I'll be happy to answer any questions on this particular ordinance.
Does anyone have questions? No one has questions?
I have a question. I have a comment. I think it's really well done, and I'm excited about this. Thank you.
I'm just sitting here in disbelief that you went through all these ordinances. Mr. Ledwith said that you were very knowledgeable on this stuff, and I'm very impressed. You've explained all this very well, especially to a newbie.
Much better than I did yesterday, Chairman.
No, you did. No, you did. You did very well. So that was our last ordinance to go over. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Ledwith, if you could just quickly go through the dates that these will come in front of, that each of these ordinances will come in front of the council, just so that we can make a comprehensive list in my notes. And
I will. I'll do that for you right now, Madam Chair, and then I'll follow up with an email to everybody as well. So starting with the last two ordinances, as I said earlier, our town planner and deputy corporation counsel will spend some time on the language with the ordinances, particularly with the commercial zoning change. That involves, as Mr. Dumais knows much better than I, it involves crossover into a couple of other different areas. So they will ensure that we get the language right in that particular ordinance. So if everything goes smoothly with those, the final draft of both those ordinances, we would place them on the town council agenda for referral on May 23rd. So from there, they would go to TPZ, and then they would be set for a public hearing with the town council on July 11th. The first three that we talked about, the accessory dwelling units, the parking standards, and then the special use permit, we would have all three of those ordinances on the May 11th town council agenda to be referred to TPZ and set for hearing with the town council on June 13th, sorry. But I will put this all in writing to the committee as well, so you're aware of all the dates.
okay, thank you very much. And so the next thing on the agenda is the Complete Streets Annual Report. And is it Mr. Martin that is doing that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we will have,
sorry.
Mr. Martin will introduce our town engineer, Greg Summer, who will go over the Complete Streets report. So the town council did adopt a Complete Streets policy back in 2015. And every year we provide the town council and the town overall with a summary of the annual report that's produced that demonstrates our progress towards complete streets. So through you, Madam Chair, I think we'll turn it directly over to Mr. Summer. Is that correct? Okay, go ahead, Greg.
All right, thank you, Mr. Manager, and good evening. Greg Summer, Town Engineer. I just want to take a few moments to go through our achievements over the past year, summarizing our Complete Streets efforts. And I just first want to recognize Jim Brennan, who put the report together. He couldn't be here tonight. He's on a well-deserved vacation, but he did the lion's share of organizing and pulling this report together. I'll try and share this just so we can pull it up on the screen, and then I'll go through it. Everybody sees that?
Yep.
All right, thank you. So this year we've invested about almost close to $2 million on complete streets elements. So that would include things
Can you make it any bigger? I've got it at home, but anybody watching, that'll be a little hard. Thank you.
Is that any better?
Better.
So we made improvements are related to the bicycles. We spent about $31,000 on bikes. The significant piece of this is the Trout Brook Trail, which I'll get to in a moment. That was about a little over $800,000. And then pedestrian sidewalk improvements really carried the bulk of this at $1.1 million. And then some additional traffic calming to the tune of about $662,000 worth of improvements. So summarized in this table is just a brief overview of the bicycle facilities that we currently have, and you can see the mileage that we've added during the past year. Slight reduction in the bicycle routes. These are shared facilities, and the reason for the reduction is we actually upgraded that facility, converting it to a traditional bike lane, so a higher level facility, if you will. In total, we added about 5 miles of bike facilities over the past year. Included, and jump ahead here, on there's a section of Farmington Avenue, a section of North Main Street. We also added some on Oakwood Avenue, Webster Hill, and Mayflower. And I just want to mention too that, you know, obviously these are well received by the majority of the community, but we have had instances when, especially when we're looking to remove parking, either from both sides or one side of the street, that we do get some pushback from residents. That was an issue particularly last year on Webster Hill, Mayflower, and on Farmington Avenue. We did get quite a bit of pushback from those property owners, so we were able to kind of come to a collective compromise that ended up with the facilities that you see out there today. But there was a little pushback that we did receive from the neighborhood. And we're seeing that a little bit this year as well. As if you'll recall, in February, we talked about bike facilities that were planned for Boulevard this month. And, you know, we are hearing some a little bit of negativity from some of those property owners that we're currently working through, but just wanted to include that little footnote. As we continue through, we also had some bike parking. We were able to get some grant funding for some free bike hitches, which we installed down in the Elmwood area of town. The Trout Brook Trail, as I mentioned, that kind of took phase 5 is the bulk of the money that we spent on complete streets. We've completed the phase 5 section, which is from Farmington Avenue to Fern Street, about 2,900 feet. That's been very well received by the community. We've had some great comments and feedback on that. It is actually recognized by Bike Walk Connecticut as the Trail of the Month in May of 22. So that's been a well received project, and we're actually continuing construction currently on phase 6, which is the piece just to the north from Fern Street up to Duffield. So that should be completed later this summer, hopefully. Pedestrian improvements, as I mentioned, we spent almost $1 million on sidewalks and then some additional money on ramps and crosswalks. We're making pretty good progress. As you can see, there's probably about 250 sidewalk work orders that we're able to address over the past year. Unfortunately, we got about 210 new ones that came in. So it's kind of a never-ending battle. Our backlog's about 1,000 work orders, give or take. So even with the funding that we receive, really only goes so far, but we're doing the best we can, trying to address as many of those systematically and geographically when it makes the most sense. This past year, we also tapped into a new funding source through the Community Development Block Grant. So that opened up an additional a little over $200,000 in funding that allowed us to do some additional sidewalk work in select areas of the town that qualified under that program. So as I mentioned, we added some sidewalk ramps as well. The one at Trout Brook and Asylum, this includes some accessible pedestrian signal equipment. So we incorporated that, as well as some crosswalks, not only refresh, but then adding some new crosswalks that we received requests for at some of our busier intersections in town, or where it makes logical sense if there's a sidewalk connection that might be lacking. A couple of the signal improvements that we implemented, one at Farmington and Troutbrook, again at Troutbrook and Asylum. And these are the audible pedestrian push buttons. They give you that wait message, and they tell you that the walk signal's on. They also have the vibro-tactile arrow buttons to help with our visually impaired or those that are hard of hearing. Some of the traffic calming that came out of our neighborhood street traffic calming program, we implemented some semi-diverters at the intersection of Riggs Avenue at Boulevard towards the end of last year. And then we also did some speed humps on Hillcrest Avenue to address an issue that we had with speeding in that neighborhood. Road diet, obviously this has been implemented, but we're still working through some of the recommendations that came out of that study. So it includes there the pedestrian warning signals that you see at the crosswalk North Main near Wynwood, just north of ASD. So that's been well received by the community, but we are still working through some issues with traffic not yielding to pedestrians. But again, that was one of the recommendations that came out of the study and that we were able to implement last year. And then lastly, a new section that we added to the report. This just talks about the vulnerable users that were involved in crashes. So we kind of did a little bit of a summary so you could kind of see a trend. We are in 2022. We obviously turned it downwards, but at the end of the year, we unfortunately had those the fatal crashes. So it's not truly an accurate representation, if you will, that we're trending in the right direction. But in total, last year there was 24 crashes involving either a pedestrian or a cyclist, and we just wanted to kind of capture that and present some of that information as another way to kind of benchmark and measure performance with this program. And then we just broke it down by the severity in terms of injury. And then we also looked at the contributing factors of the crash to understand, really who's at fault and what, if any, police enforcement action was taken. So this report is available on the town's website on the engineering division page. So it's been shared with the Pedestrian Bicycle Commission as well. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions anyone might have.
Does anyone have questions? Councilor Winograd?
Through you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Greg, for great report. It is required that when we talk about complete streets, we note that our mayor was deeply involved in getting this whole plan started, and part of the great thing about complete streets was just sort of forcing these all to do these reports every year so we can all keep track and just observing progress. It helps get more progress. So you can blame her for whatever work she's doing with this, but thank you for this. Just one question. On the last slide, I know that there's been, I guess, a letter and some social media from Bike West Hartford regarding sort of the heat map of where incidents are happening. And they've been asking, obviously, and I'm sure it goes along with Vision Zero, to prioritize areas based on where we are seeing more incidents. It might be helpful, again, to add that to sort of the reporting to see where things are, and kind of track that to see if we can identify particular intersections. I think we all kind of know where they are, and it's no surprise that the main streets are the ones that we're going to have the most volume, but of incidents. But that just might be helpful to show mapping of it for future reports.
Okay, thank you for that comment. We'll certainly look at that for next year's report.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Councilor Poland?
No, you shouldn't have the mayor go first. It's fine.
Oh,
Oh,
I
no,
can't.
oh, no, you go first.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And through you, Madam Chair, just a question about the sidewalk improvements. What are the resources that you all would need in order to try to get rid of that backlog? Is it materials? Is it time? Is it people? For a combination?
Really, it comes down to funding. Last year we were able to have 2 contractors working. We've also had I guess technically really 4. 2 that did major concrete work where we actually replacing sidewalk slabs. There's another contractor that we employed to just saw cut, little tiny trip hazards, which is, costly, but it's also very quick and efficient way to, as more of a temporary measure. So we use that as well. But yeah, I think really it's funding is the biggest driver, because we could certainly get additional contractors, manage them. There's no shortage of work. It's just the funding mechanism really.
Madam
Yeah,
Mayor?
thank you.
Oh,
Thank
sorry.
you. I
And
appreciate that.
That's a great point, Councilor Pullen, but I know we have done, grinding has been a very big help for us to bridge when, a sidewalk might be unsafe. And from what I understand from John Phillips, is that we gather those sites and then get the grinder and do multiple sites at once. I'm not sure that, but I do want to say that, we would not be in the position we are without the Complete Streets and all the work that staff has done with, looking at how to better, make our streets as accessible as they are. And we have issues, no question. And we again would not be able to access funding for Vision Zero if we didn't have Complete Streets policy and action plan on this. And the work that's been done over the last 8 years with this Complete Streets is, when you look back at the progress, it is pretty remarkable. So I want to say thank you to staff for your partnership in this, and know that, we know we have more work to do, but this is a really helpful data point, and gives us tools to be able to make things even better. So thank you.
If there are no other questions, we can move on to communications. Mr. Ledwith, are there any communications?
Thank you, Madam Chair, that we have no communications for the committee this evening. And then last up on the agenda, we did have a community development staff report, which I'd remind Mr. Martin that our committee has been going at it from early this morning to late in the evening, and as quickly as you could summarize your report would be helpful, I'm sure. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'll do my best. Dwayne Martin, Director of Community Development. So I did submit a report. I just wanted to highlight a few things to make people aware. We are challenged with staff shortages in planning and zoning. We did lose our zoning enforcement officer, so we're down to 3 full-time employees in P&Z, but we are working on that. There are advertisements out. We did hire a planning and zoning technician who will start in June. So we're hopeful over the course of the next few months to get to 6, full-time employees in planning and zoning to assist Mr. Dumais. Our building division has grown, and we are seeing positive results from that. Tim McClochie, the supervisor of inspections, is here if you have any specific questions. But we did add on a part-time staff assistant, part-time building inspector, and a couple full-time building inspectors over the course of the past couple months. And the numbers, the performance measures that I put in the department report are reflecting those positive changes, more so on what I refer to as the front end processing of permits. So our staff, through our new City View program, is doing permit verifications, and we pretty much caught up to within a week of those coming in. We are able to verify and push them along the path through the division. Where we're struggling still is catching up on plan reviews and inspections, but we're hoping that with the new staff, those improvements will be visible as well. So fingers crossed there. Again, Mr. McCloskey's here if anybody has any specific questions. Two other things I wanted to highlight with regards to the department. We are working with a consultant for our Vision Zero action plan as well as our bicycle facility plan update. We have pinned down the scope. We hope to have a contract signed within the next few days, and you'll see that consultant moving forward, taking a much more active role in our task force and behind the scenes work on that. The goal is to deliver a Vision Zero action plan by the end of this calendar year to the town manager and town council. We will continue to work as we can as a task force with their guidance to get quick build measures implemented as soon as possible. But there'll be a lot more to come on that. Just wanted to make you aware we are making progress with that contract. And then lastly, as you're probably well aware, LaSalle Road was modified from a one-way street to a two-way street recently. The only reason I bring that up is we have not forgotten the neighborhood in the vicinity of LaSalle Road that had issues and complaints and concerns with that Arapahoe redevelopment. So the engineering division under Mr. Summer will monitor the traffic in that area and circle back with the neighborhood with recommendations, if any, to do traffic calming or modifications to improve the traffic speeds, crashes, and volume that were raised as previous concerns. I think the schedule is to continue to monitor and have some results by the summertime and report back to the neighborhood. And that concludes my report. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions on the report? Okay. Any future agenda items? No? Okay.
Todd's gonna keep us busy.
Yeah, for sure. Then I will make a motion to adjourn. The time is 6:13 p.m. Thank you all for presenting all of this information to us. And hope everyone has a good evening.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.